Greetings. Welcome to Lansing Online News Radio. This is Bonnie Buckaroo, WLNZ, 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're in the basement of the LCC Learning and Technology Center, and I'm going to be joined soon by my co-host, Bill Castanier. Greetings, Bill. Good to see you. We've been having a little discussion here earlier about the book that you wanted to mention. You said that you've run into this interesting and sort of disturbing children's book.
I won't laugh too much. I got a book in the mail the other day to review. I love alphabet books to start with. I think they're just very creative and they're nice ways to teach young children about letters and sounds.
A is for apple kind of stuff?
A is for apple, B is for backyard or whatever. This one was T is for Titanic. It's a real serious book. It wasn't a spoof. So it was, and there were things like L is for
L?
Lifeboat.
Lifeboat.
Sure.
We know what I is for.
Iceberg.
Iceberg.
Which killed everyone. Not everyone, about 1,300. But Z was for Zimmerman, who was one of the unfortunate few.
Isn't that bizarre?
It was really strange. It was maybe the strangest book I've got to date. I don't know what parent would buy that for a kid and read it to him.
Maybe only if you had some family member of the past that didn't make it through the Titanic. Maybe that would be the way to break the news to little Junior.
If your name was Zimmerman. I can see the survivors of Zimmerman running out to buy the book. That was just, I thought I'd mention that in case anyone wants to run out and buy that alphabet book.
Well, the main theme of our show tonight, I hope, will be a little less gloomy than that kind of children's book. I keep wondering what kind of child would really enjoy that. I mean, that does make you a little bit nervous. Maybe the kids out of one of those Charles Addams cartoons. Yeah. Little Wednesday or Pugsley, maybe.
So the idea I had once with a friend of mine, we were writing kids' books, is to do R is for Rust Belt. It's not so absurd.
Oh, you could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had some funny ones.
Another cheery topic.
Yeah,
however.
it was. It was really.
Speaking of Rust Belt, however, Bill, and that's a very good segue into the discussion we're going to be having this evening. Our focus tonight is going to be looking at the emerging social movement. It may be more cultural than it is political right now. The Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Lansing. Many of us were down there over the weekend. Bill, you drove by and got depressed and didn't come back. Is that right?
That's right. I was down there so Homeland Security could scope me out at about. It was actually 9:40. There wasn't one person there at 9:40.
He called me because I was picking up two students who were doing a video and photograph with me, and he said he was so depressed that I said, but you have to come back. Maybe everybody's just sort of waiting around the corner because we had, 50-mile-an-hour winds. It wasn't exactly the most cheerful place.
As I saw in your video, there were a substantial number of people that show up, and that's why I think maybe one of the characteristics of this kind of event is it happens when it happens.
Well, yeah. I mean, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning on a drizzly and sort of gray Saturday morning in downtown Lansing when the winds are 35 to 50 miles an hour is not exactly the greatest place to be. And what was our other big competition?
The University of Michigan versus MSU, just down the street. Not 100,000. What did they get? 80,000 at MSU Stadium, approximately. So that was a big deal.
So the ratio was about 500 maximum downtown to 80,000 in East Lansing. That sort of says a lot about the priorities.
They were serving beer in East Lansing.
Well, they weren't serving beer downtown. And now that all the medical marijuana shops have closed, there's a little less entertainment in the downtown community. I'd like to introduce one of our first guests this evening, Ray Holman from the UAW Chapter 6000 here in Lansing. Ray, you went down to Occupy Wall Street last weekend, didn't you?
Yeah, on October 8th, we had a group of state employees and also some other Michigan citizens, and we made a trip to New York City, and it was a great experience. We felt like we needed to plant our feet in New York and represent Michigan because who knows better, what's been happening more than people here in the Great Lakes state. We've been suffering with a bad economy for over 10 years, but we really fell off a cliff in 2008. It was a direct result of greed on Wall Street and gambling. And so we felt like we really had a story to tell, and we were real motivated to get to New York and be part of it. And it was a great event, and we're really glad we won.
How many were there in your contingent? What kinds of things did you do? Who'd you talk to?
Well, we started out as 20, but by the time 4 o'clock rolled around Saturday morning, there was 9 of us in 2 different cars. But hey, you know what? We made the trip down there, and it was great being in New York because we also took some of the same people also went to Madison, Wisconsin last year.
Oh, you made
And
the trip up there.
yeah, and so it was a little bit different because obviously New York City is maybe the biggest city in the world and very densely populated. So it's sort of interesting seeing a protest in the middle of maybe the greatest city in the world, which is a little bit different flavor than Madison, Wisconsin, where the Capitol was packed and the lawn was packed. But having said that, I was impressed with the variety of people there. I mean, we saw people in costume, but we also saw more conventionally dressed people. There was quite a large police presence, but when we were there, we didn't see any violence. Everybody seemed to be getting along very well. We were there for about a day and a half. But again, you know, being from Michigan, we felt like we had a story to tell, and it was great to be there. We did a lot of interviews. Hopefully, we sparked people's curiosity, and I'm happy to see that stuff is spreading around the nation.
Do you think that were there people from other states doing what you were doing? Could you identify people by state? Was that how they were doing it with signs?
You know, mostly they were all homemade signs. We did have our UAW Local 6000 signs. I had a sign that said tax breaks for families, not corporations. But most of the signs were homemade. There was no real clear leadership. I mean, there was some organization, and it was interesting to see how people communicated there. But it was a little bit different than other rallies where there wasn't, you know, chain of command, more or less. It was more of a grassroots type of thing. Again, they did have this system of communicating with, I guess they call it voice mic, where one person gives some instructions, about 30 or 40 other people jump in so the larger group could hear. So it was interesting to see that.
They used that downtown in Lansing at the Capitol. And at first it seemed kind of annoying, but you got used to it and it had a nice rhythm to it. Did you go to both Zuccotti Park and to the Wall Street protests?
Well, we were at Zuccotti Park, which is right next to where the World Trade Center's buildings were. And so that was real interesting too, because it was right down there at the ground zero, I guess, regarding 9/11. But we were the whole time at Zuccotti Park. Every once in a while, a group of people would try to leave the park. And it was kind of humorous because then a bunch of policemen on Segways would chase after them and sort of try to corral them back into the park. But as long as you stayed in the park, the police really left you alone. But if you tried to get like a group of 30 or 40 people to make a run for it, you got a lot of attention from the cops.
You know, Karen Creighton, who used to be our intern on this show, posted a video today on SpartanEdge.com of another Michigan person who was at the event. Her name was Anna Catherine Sluka. She was arrested 2 times, and then she spoke at the event on Saturday here in Lansing. She's an incredibly articulate person.
Young woman.
She may not be the leader, but she certainly could be.
When I saw her, I thought that's our next Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was the great labor organizer of the early 20th century and was known as the rebel girl. And she really had that kind of presence on it. I really thought so.
We're joined by Dr. Ann Larrabee, Michigan State University, Writing Rhetoric, American Culture, and she's done a lot of work on protest movements in the past. How would you, when you took a look at what happened at the Capitol, how does this fit into that grand tradition of protests in the United States?
I think it's beautiful. One thing I really love about this social movement, Occupy Wall Street, is that it's aware of itself as a social movement. And I've never seen this before where, you know, because I hear the young people talking about their strategies, their tactics. They're aware that social movements have to catch the zeitgeist. They're not sure whether they are or not. They see signs of this. But in a way, because I've heard them express that they're not concerned about catching the zeitgeist. They're going to do it anyway, even if it doesn't feel like, you know, that there's a force behind them because they feel so passionately about this. And I think that young people right now are facing the consequences of what we've seen from Wall Street. They're the ones who are carrying such a heavy student debt, few job prospects. It's just wonderful to see them standing up and talking about this. And the kinds of things that they're talking about, the kind of changes they're talking about, I think are completely articulate. I think they're completely sound. I think they're rational. I don't see them as being an amorphous, directionless group. I think there's a lot coming from Occupy Wall Street that's really an important expression. And certainly it fits into a 20th century tradition of protest. especially going back, I think, to the 19th century with labor organizing. And I'm thinking once again of the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, that went to every town during their free speech fights and gave readings of the First Amendment. And this is a lot like this. It's really exciting, I think.
You know, when I was down there, I was wondering, there was some union presence in the sense they kept saying that the water had been donated by the Greater Lansing Labor Council. Was there much of a organized union presence here in Lansing on Saturday? It didn't seem to have the numbers that it might have had in some of the protests earlier this year where legislation specifically aimed at unions was coming to the...
Well, what I can say is the UAW, President Bob King, we do support, through the UAW, does officially support Occupy Wall Street. And I know that the AFL-CIO nationally does as well. Today I was at a CAP conference at Michigan State University for the UAW. And it was kind of interesting because I heard certain catchphrases coming out all day during the conference, like the 99% of us and the occupiers. And nobody said anything officially about it, but I was just hearing certain words popping out. And so I'm hoping this thing can grow and turn into something. I mean, it's about time because, like again, the Wall Street greed and the flat out corruption and criminality that occurred in 2008 is just locking people out. You mentioned the young people. They don't have an opportunity, or at least a lot of people feel hopeless. You're looking at our urban centers in Michigan. I think there's a sense of people just aren't allowed, or they're on the outside looking in. And it's about time that we come together peacefully and make something happen. And again, that's why we decided to make the trip to Wall Street.
I keep hearing about how young college graduates only have a 6% unemployment rate compared to the much higher rates for older adults. But the reality is what you're seeing are kids trapped in these endless succession of internships where they're making barely minimum wage year after year. It doesn't lead to a real job. And I've had very top students that have done internship after internship for no real job. It deflates the total figure, but the misery out there with those debts begin to kick in is really something. I would like to bring in Dr. Michael Stam of the Department of History at Michigan State because he really knows media in the Great Depression era. And I think there are some similarities between what we're seeing then and now, except really now you have social media that organize things that you didn't have in the 30s.
That's exactly right. It's one of those things, it's a lot of people overrate social media, I think. And I think this is one of those cases where it really is doing some of those things, some of the sort of utopian things that people would hope that it would do. It's actually, I think, generating I think it's filtering up. I mean, the New York Times, after sort of ignoring and sort of mocking the story for a while, was forced, came out with an editorial that was very much in favor of it. It's driving the news cycle. I mean, I think it's actually filtered up into the mainstream media when I think many of them just would have preferred to ignore it after kind of having a little fun with it for a few days. That stuff makes good copy. I think the Tea Party showed that as well. But
I think the difference here really were some of the YouTube videos that showed the police action against the young girls. We knew that police tactics. I trained police for 9 years and worked with the New York City Police Department. And you have to remember that there are, depending on the year, 38 to 42,000 police officers there. I've lived in cities that are smaller than that, so you can't control everybody. But what you saw were inspectors, the guys in the white shirts, using techniques like that orange mesh that they were kettling people who really weren't doing anything that deserved to be segregated, and then pepper spraying. And that really drew the attention of mainstream.
Yeah, it was like what happened in Alabama in the 1960s. I mean, people seeing this stuff, I think, really galvanized. It's one thing to hear about it and have this abstract sense of it happening, but I mean, the proof is in the pudding. People saw it, and I think that really galvanized a lot of people's opinions in favor of the protesters and really made them understand what was going on.
One of the other things that's happened is this material is archived where it wasn't really in the same way in the 20s and 30s. You can go on tons of Facebook pages right now and see this material. In fact, you posted, Bonnie, some great video today. So
from people down at Saturday's Rally, yeah. I mean, you can do that immediately. You can go home, you can post immediately, you can upload, and it's there forever. It's it's not like the newspaper that became Line the Birdcage the next day or Wrap the Dead Fish. The other thing that I wondered about, though, is that if you look at the roots of what really has been happening, the first signs that I ever saw of Occupy Wall Street came in Adbusters. the Culture Jamming magazine out of Canada.
Mhm.
And I used to chat with their editor and their publisher about how they could make better use of the web. And I think they've caught on very quickly from what I could see, because that's a Canadian publication, really. All they did was run that one ad of the ballet dancer standing on the back of the Morgan Stanley or Merrill Lynch Bull. And it really sparked everything. It just said, come and bring your tent. And here we are. Is that the kind of, I mean, that's not what we saw in the 30s.
No, I mean, I think it was somewhat. I mean, people certainly still did organize. I mean, there were things like the bonus march that went on, and it's not like social movements are new to the 21st century in social media. But I do think that the social media have enabled people to do this more quickly, and they've enabled people to coordinate across the country in ways that were really unprecedented. I mean, you look at what had gone on, say, in Berkeley in the 1960s, or the University of Michigan campus in the 1960s, and they are, to some degree, isolated campuses. But now that you've got people that can instantaneously talk to each other in public fora using these social media, and so you have these places, pulling in smaller, really small towns in some places that have these Occupy movements because they're able to get plugged into these things in ways that I think were much, much more difficult to do 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Those who have seen my Facebook page have seen my picture of me holding the Occupy Mason sign in front of the courthouse in Mason. And as I say, if I can bring my neighbor along next week, we will double the number of Occupy. It doesn't take much when you're the only one.
It's also a powerful thing in that it allows people to put evidence of them doing something out there. I mean, that's often one of the biggest impediments for people participating in social movements is a fear of reprisal or a fear of being mocked or a fear of violence against them. But seeing other people do it in public, I think, is a powerfully sort of enabling thing. And these things like YouTube or the new social media have allowed people to show others that they're doing it, and I think give confidence to people that they're not sort of alone in doing these sorts of things.
You're listening to WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. One of the things that I thought about related to the police action was that was what really attracted the mainstream media finally. I think there was some sense of frustration early on that the movement was being marginalized or ignored. That was a challenge because, what we've seen is that there were 115,000 students in Madison, Wisconsin, and students and others on that famous Saturday where they brought everybody down to the Capitol. I read the other day that there were roughly 100,000 in Tahrir Square. And if you look at the amount of TV coverage that Tahrir Square got, and it was all very praising that, they shouldn't be touched, they shouldn't be harmed, don't move them out of the square, whatever you do. That wasn't quite what we heard about Madison, however. It wasn't treated in the same way. It didn't receive the same amount of attention. How does this current movement connect to that Madison experience and what went on during the summer?
Well, I think, we saw it happen in Egypt, and I think that helped contribute to what happened in Wisconsin. And then going on to New York here. But I gotta believe that a lot of what's going on, I think, is really people, again, waking up to the corruption on Wall Street and the fact that 1% of the population controls over 50% of the wealth and has way too much power, and people, again, are locked out. And I think that finally, hopefully, people are waking up to that. And there's things that can happen or that we can do. Like, for example, I know there's talk about, taxing people on the first dollar they earn after $1 million. Not that they have $1 million, the first dollar after they earn $1 million, a surcharge. There's certain things like that we could do to help out. And that's another reason I think it was important for people to, a lot of the stuff is man-made and some of the stuff can be corrected. I mean, we've got horrible trade policies and there's globalization, etc. But there are some common sense things we can do and ask for some real shared sacrifice. UAW in particular, we're not asking for businesses to give up or not be successful, and we want to compete globally. But there needs, again, be some shared sacrifice. I mean, you can tax somebody a little bit higher after the first dollar they make in excess of $1 million. Again, 1% controls 50% of the wealth in this country. Eventually, things are going to cave in on themselves, and I think people hopefully are starting to realize that.
And one of the differences, though, is I got the sense from this group, that they're more radical about restructuring than they are necessarily just reforming. It didn't seem to me that they would necessarily be interested in sort of fine-line legislative policy issues as much as there needs to be a fundamental shift of power where we control corporations. Dylan Ratigan of MSNBC has been down there trying to urge them to sign up for the Get Money Out Now program, sign up to pass a constitutional amendment to take away personhood from corporations. And somebody, I saw one of the sign the other day that said, "If corporations were really people, why hasn't Texas executed one?" And I thought that was a pretty good one. So I like some of the signs I've been seeing. But it seem they're asking for a more fundamental change than just they can't be bought up by a few policy positions. It didn't seem to me.
Yes, and I think that's why I would call this a radical movement rather than a reform movement. That it's not going for simple reform. It's really going for a shift in consciousness. It's going for major structural changes. I think it reflects other movements in the past, like in the 60s and the civil rights movement, and like those movements, it has a global resonance because last weekend we saw a lot of protests in Europe at the same time, and even though in each of those countries there are different kinds of issues, still there's a frame that's being shared about more equitable societies that nurture their people and getting away from a kind of greed frame. And I also think that connects to the ways that social movements use culture. For example, they use graphic design, they use songs, they use costume, they use posters, they use all of these things as a way of attracting people with a sense of belonging. So people have to have a sense that they're belonging to something larger than just, restoring the Glass-Steagall. Right. That's not going to motivate people. What's going to motivate people is, identity and belonging and these kinds of resonances, I think. So.
Did you get a sense when you were down there, Michael, on Saturday that there was really a sort of budding community there? I mean, I saw so many people I knew. There's a sort of, maybe leftover 60s group meshing with a group of young people, and that there was a sense that the way this carries on is sort of forming some sort of community. How will they communicate? How will they sustain this over time? What kinds of mechanisms can they use?
I mean, I think they can just keep using the same ones they've been doing. I mean, they have them in place already. I mean, they had enough of a network to get a few hundred people down there on a Saturday where there's a big football game going on 3 miles down the street. I mean, I think that says a lot about what can be done going forward. I mean, I think that, as Ann said, I think the real challenge is creating a culture that keeps people engaged in the movement. It's one thing to stir people up. It's another thing to engage them and institutionalize what's going on and really keep it motivated. I mean, keeping things going, I think, is often the real challenge. But they clearly have the networks in place already to do this stuff.
I mean, I just checked online. Detroit Facebook, Occupy Detroit has 6,800 members now. Lansing has about 750, but 6,800, I was surprised. That's pretty significant.
Lansing had 1,700 when I checked it last time on Saturday.
750, it said.
Well, I think it may be on a different page. I think there's more than one.
See, there could be more than one.
But tell me, just as a point of reference, remember when they tried to change the Sparty logo?
Yeah,
how many did that get?
30, 40, 50, 100,000, I forgot.
We know where our priorities are.
And that was important because look what happened with goofy uniforms they wore on Saturday.
See, yes.
Military combat uniforms.
Well, it was very interesting because a friend came up to me and said, make sure to get the vet who's speaking. And it was interesting because I think everybody wants to make sure that sort of all the buttons are pushed, that we are showing that there are representatives from all of the major groups in the country. Did you see, I heard that there were actually some Tea Partiers down at the Occupy Wall Street. Was that evident to you? Or?
Are you talking about in New York?
Yeah.
I don't think I saw any. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, there was just a huge variety of people, and everybody was sort of really crammed into this park, this 30,000 square foot park, I guess. And but I couldn't really tell if there's any Tea Party there. I mean, there was definitely a variety of people, and talking about the costumes and the homemade signs, and there was people playing drums and juggling and doing different things. So it was a real active group, but I couldn't really determine if there were any Tea Party people there. But who knows? Maybe they were there.
Well, what are we going to see as the next step? Ray, you went by there tonight, and you said you actually think that the number of tents down at Rudder Park is growing.
Yeah, I drove by before I came on the air tonight just to kind of get a visual, and there's definitely a lot more tents than there were a few days ago. There were people holding signs, and I drove by and honked my horn, and other people were honking their horn. So it looks like there's some committed people. There's a community there for sure. So that was just, 25 minutes ago. Hopefully, though, we can push the parties, at least maybe the Democratic Party, to become more socially progressive. I mean, you're talking about changing tax laws or financing laws and regulations. And I'd like to see a big fundamental change, personally, but I'm also hoping this movement can make, for example, the Democratic Party more progressive, and embolden them to be more progressive. And I think that's been part of the problem in the past.
I think there'll be a real tension between the people in the Democratic Party who will want to co-opt and embrace this movement. As I said the other day, all too often we see people jumping in front of them as if they're leading that parade, when they really, just trying to take advantage of them. And at the same time, I think it will help pull the party to the left. We haven't really had a counterweight to the right in an awful long time, it seems, in any organized kind of way or any kind of powerful way. You see a shift in power coming down?
Well, before we go there, I noticed on your video, I watched it with you, Mayor Verge Bonero was on there. And
I did a separate video on Verge.
Yeah. And I admire that he did that, because not many mayors, no matter what size city, have guts to really do those kind of things. He gave a really good speech. He had his father there. I'd really recommend people go watch it. I mean,
Julio in his 90s.
Yes, he's showing up. I mean, Verge is showing up for those things. So there is maybe he's sort of the outlier in the party, but he's still out there.
He's MSNBC's favorite populist mayor, and he really has taken on that role and embraced it. I was amused by the fact he was standing there with what appeared to be a stack of envelopes he'd written his notes on. I guess he couldn't find any note cards, so he was busy shuffling through these envelopes. But he really gave kind of a barn burner of a speech and made it clear that he was on the side of this movement. It's not clear to me that the organized Democratic Party will ultimately be very, very happy with this movement. They would like to think it will help deliver votes. I'm not sure that it's a very good delivering mechanism. What's your sense of that?
I wouldn't think that it is a good vote delivering mechanism. I mean, I don't think that Occupy Wall Street participants want to be co-opted by the Democratic Party. They're very adamant about keeping lots of diverse identities and being all encompassing, and so I think that they're going to be reluctant, as I would be, to sign on to that kind of programmatic effort. I'm really interested too in the relationship between Occupy Wall Street and the labor movement, because labor has been really overlooked by media. When it had hit its protest marches and so forth, it hasn't been covered. I mean, if we talk about overlooked stories, it's a story of what labor has been doing. So it's interesting to me too that labor and Occupy have started to form relationships, and it's going to be interesting to see what those look like.
Yeah, I think right now we're on the same page, meaning, for example, I represent state employees, and we have 5 different bargaining units, and for the first time ever, we're all bargaining together.
Really?
Yes, and we have 35,000 strong. We're the largest local at 17,000, but with all the other units together, we're over 35,000. And again, today I was at a UAW conference at Michigan State University, and some of the Democratic leaders were there and labor leaders, and everybody was saying, we've really been forced to really have solidarity for the first time because things have gotten so drastic. And when you're talking about Michigan, I mean, we're facing now, I believe the count is now 82 bills that go after working people, go after collective bargaining rights. You're actually talking about legislation that will put people in jail for up to a year. For example, if a teacher were to send Governor Snyder an email saying, please don't cut education or protect collective bargaining rights, you're actually talking about throwing people in jail. You're talking about fining people up to $1,000 a day for engaging in a picket. These are the type of things that we're dealing with right now in the legislature. The attacks on collective bargaining. You're talking about the emergency manager bill. You're talking about gutting workman's comp. There's a bill right now, House Bill 5002, that's going to totally rewrite workman's comp. There's bills out there to totally undo unemployment insurance. I mean, it is off the chart.
I don't mean to denigrate and say that we don't need to look at legislative outcomes and reform outcomes, because what we really are is we're under this major assault. When we look at places like the Mackinac Center here, right in the state of Michigan, we look at groups like ALEC, the American Legislative, Exchange Council, which literally just writes the legislation, hands it off to the new GOP governors and says to them, run with it. And so they're putting these slew of bills through. I saw a woman there collecting petition signatures to try to repeal the emergency manager bill. It just seems we can't even keep up, though. I mean, if we keep trying to handle it bill after bill after bill, especially with a GOP-dominated government here in Michigan, I think we need some sort of fundamental shift of power. This sort of Koch brothers funded legislative initiative is really hard to roll back.
That's right, and that's why I think maybe, hopefully, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Lansing, etc., will keep growing, and we can have, an awareness, and people can start waking up. Because you're right, we can't handle it. I mean, every week there's a new bill, there's a new attack, and not just labor, people have jobs, but working people, families. They are cutting people off cash assistance. They're changing the rules for food stamps. So if you have a car that's worth, $15,000 and you lose your job, you're gonna have to sell your car. You're gonna have to spend down your retirement savings to get food stamps. I mean, every single front we're coming under attack. And again, that's why I'm encouraged and hoping that this movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, can continue to grow as long as it's peaceful.
You're listening to WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. One of the women that I interviewed for the video, not anyone I knew, told me that she's been unemployed for 3 years. She's in her early 60s. And she said that I asked her, I said, are you worried about this cutoff of welfare benefits because you're in this transitional era? And she said, well, I didn't have to worry because I have no assets. She said, I've already had to get rid of my car and I can't get a new car or any other kind of car because I can't get the insurance since I have no medical care. She's now taking early Social Security. She doesn't know what she's going to do. Bill and I talked with another woman last week who her daughter and son-in-law have moved back in with her. She had an 800 square foot house, has had to take her retirement to buy and put on an extension so that they can live with her because they've been long-term unemployed, can't seem to find anything. It's really getting grim, and it seems to be getting grimmer. Now that the cash assistance to the states is gone and the stimulus money is gone, Michael, why doesn't the mainstream media pick up on this? It doesn't seem that we hear this. We may hear about the Occupy movement, but we don't seem to be hearing the stories of real people out here.
I'm not sure. I wonder if their thinking is that there's a fatigue on the part of people that we've been hearing this for years now. These are horrible stories, and maybe it's a situation in newsrooms where they feel like they reported that story. What else is there to say? I'm not saying that's what I think, but I think that might be something that some of these mainstream organizations might be thinking in terms of not covering them.
You might be onto something. I was watching the movie War Photographer on James Knopfler, and he was talking about how the outlets for his kind of photography, showing human misery around the world, he and photographers like Sebastião Salgado sort of traffic in these. They're gorgeous images, but they show people in extremis all around the world. And he said there are no more magazines to buy them because advertisers don't want to have their they don't want to try to sell you peanut butter for your sandwich next to a picture of a starving child.
The mainstream media institutions also tend to be fairly fickle. Look at how much of the Arab Spring was on the front pages and the lead story just a few weeks ago. And then those things kind of slide off the front page. And, the Tea Party in some ways seems like last year's news in a lot of ways. You don't see nearly as many lead stories about them these days. I think it's in some ways it's a fickle for-profit set of institutions always chasing the next news story that's going to grab as many eyeballs and ears as possible. And maybe poverty is just a tough sell for a lot of people. Again, I don't think that's right, but I think that may be what these organizations think.
I try not to be too conspiratorial, but when people try to say that MSNBC is the counterweight to Fox News, which seems under large rails to really be a GOP propaganda machine rather than a news organization, I look at MSNBC and they've gotten rid of Keith Olbermann and Cenk Uygur and a number of other people. The word seems to have come down from on high that you dare not criticize the Democratic Party. In other words, we're looking at a movement that's being critical of all the parties, saying you've all sold us out. Mm-hmm. What we're basically seeing is one corporate party with a hard right and vaguely leftish wing, and it's time that the people had more of a counterweight to that. Where do we go from here? One of the things that worries me, we're headed into winter.
Well, in terms of the Occupy folks,
yeah, it's hard to occupy when it's cold.
I keep wondering if there are going to be third parties, the legitimately electorally competitive third parties, because I think that the same things you're seeing on the left, it's the same animus that motivated the Tea Party folks, or is still motivating them on the right. They're dissatisfied with the mainstream direction of the Republican Party and are trying to pull it in the direction that they want it to go. And I think I wonder if one of the outcomes or an outcome will be third party politics.
Do you think the only reason the Tea Party has such leverage is the threat that they will form a third party if they're not catered to?
I'm not sure. They vote. I mean, that's one of the things that right wing and conservative movements have had over the left in the last half centuries. They tend to turn out to the polls, I think, in stronger numbers, and so they had the threat of numbers, I think.
But and if we look back to the 60s, I think of 68 and what television brought us with the riots, the police riot in Chicago, that didn't do the Democratic Party a whole bunch of good because the perception was these are nothing but a bunch of dope smoking hippies out there in the park, and the police were, righteously cracking down. At least that was the way a lot of the media I saw portrayed it.
Well, I think this brings us back to the question of what media,
Yeah.
because I would like to know from Michael exactly, how you perceive traditional media now, because I know that when I really want to read about a breaking news story, I go to Twitter, and I'm never on there, and I don't Twitter, but if I want to know, I will go to Twitter to see what the reporters are saying as they're on the ground. And, now that you can put in a hashtag and come up with what everybody's saying on this subject, I mean, I'm wondering just how important is traditional media now, and especially to young people who are so used to just going to Twitter, so.
I mean, I think to young people, that's in many cases, I gather, their leading source of news. But I still think for the vast majority of Americans, I think we're a sort of, perhaps a small segment of the population in that way. I mean, you look at how the strong hold that television news still has for a significant portion of the electorate around the country. I think that mainstream news is still a very powerful agent in creating people's opinions. But I agree. I think if you actually want the story, there are better ways to find the story than turning on the television or opening a mainstream newspaper.
I wondered about you and I had talked before about Father Coughlin and his role in the 30s and how Glenn Beck kind of plays the same role here now. But yet even he was considered as running too hot for Fox News. They apparently decided to jettison him. But he makes $10 million a year on his own empire, and he now has the Blaze.com, which is his online vehicle. One of the things that kind of worries me is that I don't see Glenn Beck anymore. And I used to be more aware of him. It was almost like I wanted to keep an eye on him and see what he was up to because I knew he was kind of dangerous. And, he's sending people to the gentleman that was going to go murder everybody at the Tides Foundation, tiny little foundation because Glenn Beck had singled them out for retribution. There is this niche aspect to the web where my students get news, but they don't necessarily make a qualitative judgment as to the source. And I think it's so easy for misinformation also to get into the swirl here. How do young people learn how to sort this out?
I guess that's the job of the educational. I mean, media literacy. I mean, it's kind of an easy catch-all phrase, but it's something that young people have to learn or be taught. That
more than ever.
Any one source. I mean, questioning sources, no matter what they are, whether they're mainstream, whether they're Twitter sources, and really understanding where their information is coming from, who's putting it out there, understanding its context. I mean, I think that's one of the most important things. And I think that's the educational system's job, is to teach some level of media literacy in the system so that they are not misled by anyone in the media, whether they be liberal or conservative, who doesn't have the public good in mind.
And we saw the rise of the underground press in the 60s, and it was an alternative vehicle for people to get, with a particular point of view, to get their news that wasn't being covered elsewhere. Is that really what the web is providing for us now?
I think in part, certainly, there's a kind of underground press, although it's not really underground anymore, right?
It
it's
is
highly visible, which is quite wonderful.
Yeah.
It's like the underground is visible, and that's
I had
really
a subscription to the Los Angeles Free Press when I was living in little tiny Parma, Michigan, and I would only get like 1 out of every 10 issues because the rest were stolen on the way. You know what I mean? So at least now I can tap into the internet anytime I want to.
Bonnie, that was the story they were telling. They only mailed 1 out of 10.
Well,
whoa, come on, I know better. I worked at some of those things. An MSU, former MSU student, wrote a history of the underground press in America. He's on his 2nd volume. And it's published by MSU Press. It's pretty interesting stuff.
The joint issue was here.
Joint issue is here.
We
had one of the first 5 underground newspapers in the country at MSU.
Did we?
Yep.
MSU has a history of radicalism in this state beyond what you would think U of M would have had it. I mean, to be honest about it, you would think that all those black-clad intellectuals over there would have been out to rally first, but they really weren't. It was Michigan State that was radical. I guess they tried to hold Occupy MSU, is that right? And it didn't happen at Beaumont Tower? Did you heard about this?
There was an Occupy Colleges, but I don't think it ever got off the ground in terms of organization. I don't think anybody took the lead and led people out. And I think that the way these things are happening is somebody has to take the lead. And
it doesn't seem as though the student media here fulfills the same function that student media did in the 60s. it was a lot more radical in the 60s. The student newspapers were the ones who were leading the fray. And you're not going to see that kind of article in the state news, much to the distress of Karen Crichton, who we've been talking about, the editor of Spartan Edge, wrote an editorial on the state news. They've been complaining about the apathy of MSU students, and Karen's argument was, well, that's because the state news doesn't bother telling them what's going on.
When I remember when I worked for the state news in the 60s, I remember getting together with everyone and voting. We were just days away from sending a reporter to Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah.
Your own correspondent?
Yep. We would have been the first college newspaper to do that. Now, I don't recall why we didn't, but I know the war didn't end, so I just want to give people the title of these two books. One is called Smoking Typewriters, the 60s Underground Press in America, and the other is called, just a minute, the other is called The Underground Press in America, and both the authors of those books are, John McMillan is the smoking one, and then the other one is by Ken Washburger. They're both former MSU students. They're both MSU grads.
Wow.
Pretty interesting. And those books came out this year.
Well, one big difference, I mean, we're webcasting this right now on Lansing Online News, and people who listen to the radio show, we can do this free webcast through Ustream. As long as you've got a laptop, a webcam, and some sort of hookup, you're able to do that. Adbusters has a free live webcam going all the time of what's happening on the streets there. I know I watched this summer some of the protests taking place in Greece. All of this is playing out against a huge drama in the global economy. We have about a week before we know whether the European Union is going to be able to come up with the package that the market is anticipating. And it looks like the market wants $3 trillion, and if it's going to be less than that, the market will be unhappy. Rumors to the effect that it won't be that large led to a 250-point drop at the end of the day on the Dow. This is really serious stuff. This is, on the one hand, I found Saturday very warm and friendly and inviting, but isn't there this sort of underlying sense of dread that we could be really heading into the winter of our discontent? How do we keep these kinds of movements being positive and not run the risk that they turn violent? Because things could get much grimmer, much more quickly.
Yeah, I think there was some violence overseas just this week,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken. And that is the one fear, and we talked about that today at our UAW conference, that, if it becomes violent, it can be used against us, and to be, real careful. And we know that they actually plant people to start things, push individuals into the police line or throw things. And so that is a great fear and something I believe we need to be really careful about. But you're absolutely right about the big global picture. And again, I mentioned earlier the trade laws and the giant economy that we're all part of now globally. And when you're talking about 401ks and the stock market, I mean, that's what's really scary too, because we've done away with pensions for the most part in this country.
Yes.
I was hired in the state of Michigan in the early 90s. Unfortunately, I have a pension, but I know since 1997, state employees don't have pensions. But now you look at people's 401ks and they're way down. And where do you go? There's no security anymore, and it is scary. I think about the next generation coming up. My daughter's in 9th grade, and I'm thinking about what are her opportunities going to be to have a quote unquote middle class life, where you have health insurance, where you have retirement, you have some security. And I'm just looking around. It's as if you're not a rock and roll superstar or a big CEO or maybe an MD with great, skills as a brain surgeon. You're not one of those things. You're really out in the cold, more or less. I mean, that's the way we're going. It seems to be. And so it is a, pretty scary time.
The United States has a higher level of inequality than many of the other countries that have actually had more violent protests than we have. I guess it's almost been surprising that we've been so placid for so long. Very hard to keep a middle class going when 1% of the population can take 40% of the wealth off the table, and 1 out of every $5 that's earned every year off the table, and just squirrel it away for themselves. I mean, that's an enormous amount of wealth. Any given annual GDP is really a zero-sum game in terms of the size of the pie is not going to get any bigger, so you have to fight for your share. I don't know how we tip the power. If you look at it legislatively, I recognize, Ray, that we have to figure out a way to stop this onslaught, but I don't see this group as energized in wanting to do a get out the vote. There was a huge get out the vote that I'm sure you were part of for the Obama campaign. I mean, it was enormous. I had a friend who rode the city buses during the day just to talk to people and volunteer to drive them to the polls if they needed it. I mean, that's the level of energy that there was for that campaign. I think there's a real energy for this movement, but I'm not clear where we go from here. What next steps would you like to see? What are the unions talking about in terms of an agenda that they're putting together?
Well, there's been attacks on collective bargaining rights because certain people know that if you weaken the unions, you're taking away our organizational power. And that's what we have. We can put people on the ground. We can get people phone banking. We can drive people to the polls. That's the power we have. We don't have money, but we have people on the ground. Again, but bringing it down here to Michigan, we don't have there's one party controls everything. It's the state Supreme Court, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General's office, the Senate, the House. And so all this bad legislation is just flying through right now. And so I know a big, when you're talking about strategy or plan that we have is trying to win back the House of Representatives here in Michigan.
That's the plan?
And yes, and the best way to do that is to make sure that we deliver Michigan for Barack Obama. And I know that some people are maybe a little disappointed and feel that the president wasn't progressive enough. But Michigan's going to be a must-win for him. And if we can get a large turnout for President Obama, we have a lot better chance of picking up 9 seats to take back the House of Representatives here in Michigan.
That's all it would take is 9?
9 seats. And if we don't do that, things are going to be really ugly.
Do you have targeted districts where you think that's more feasible, especially after it's been through redistricting?
Yes, we have targeted districts, absolutely.
Can people go somewhere to find out where those are? Is there a website that educates them about what your plans are?
Well, right now there's a group called We Are the People.
Okay.
And that's what they're doing. They have action teams in different parts of the state. I know they have a Facebook site, We Are the People. I know that we have a link on our webpage, uawlocal6000.org, to We Are the People. And what we're trying to do is engage people locally in their own communities so they can be involved. And there are certain House districts that are in play, that go both ways. We talked about Macomb County, Sterling Heights, Madison Heights. Those are, the Reagan Democratic areas, so to speak, where a lot of people kind of flip back and forth between the two parties. So obviously we're going to be targeting areas like that and trying to win back seats in the House. And then the other thing too is you're talking about the Michigan State Supreme Court. That's huge. It's controlled 4-3 by Republicans. There's going to be 3 seats open in 2012. And that is huge because right now this court has really been partisan. And
it's a very pro-corporate court.
Yes, and so that's another thing is the Michigan State Supreme Court.
You're listening to WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing. Bill, you
got a couple of things. We've talked about this previously about trying to motivate the medical marijuana group to be a part of that because they're probably 800,000 strong in Michigan, something like that.
They got a 63% turnout, we know, in the balloting on their initiative.
And they're not happy. They're not happy with our court system in Michigan.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. They're probably not too happy with Bill Schuette either, who really went to bat in terms of undermining them and changing the law. And it's another reason why if you should pay attention, for example, to who is the Attorney General, who is the Secretary of State, who's sitting on the state Supreme Court. I mean, these things matter.
And we need a press that also tells you that his wife is part of Big Pharma, which sometimes has a reason not to be all that happy about medical marijuana. Michael, there used to be a lively union press, and we don't see much of a union press anymore. Is it because of their declining fortunes? Or is it just that the press has changed so much? We don't have as many competing newspapers. We've seen so much media consolidation.
I'm not sure. I think the unions are still pretty vibrant in terms of getting their own message out. I mean, in terms of having websites, things like that. In the mainstream organizations, they're not covering it as much, I think, because there are less people directly involved in the labor movement. There are far fewer members. Many major metropolitan papers would have a labor correspondent. Like their beat was labor.
Right. And now we just have business.
If you're lucky, if you're lucky. I mean, you have business obviously, but I mean, there used to be somebody who would cover it, but I think the unions on their end, I think I mean, they seem to be retaining a pretty vibrant presence. I mean, I know, living in California for many years, SEIU was a major presence in public for a variety of social justice issues, many of which had nothing to do with their membership. I mean, they were in many ways a social justice organization in addition to what they were doing. So in that sense, like we were talking about earlier with the enabling qualities of these new media, they allow these things that had existed before to be things that are seen by everybody now if they go looking for them. So in a certain sense, that's a good thing.
If you look at the history of newspapers, for example, when I grew up in Cleveland, being really old, there were all these competing newspapers. And many times the name of the newspaper, it either contained independent or Democrat or Republican because they were duking it out. Or it was even, you had the Workers' Party papers in town and so forth, all trying to get your eyeballs and trying to get you to purchase their paper. As we've turned into these single newspaper towns over the year, it seemed what we moved for us from a partisan model to this corporate model that says we want as many eyeballs as possible. Mm-hmm. So we take no stands. We took this in objectivity as if somehow we're not going to call them winners or losers anymore. And I think in some ways that means that it's a very different world for a reporter to be a crusading reporter anymore.
Well, I'm sure with the union issue, there's pressure from advertisers. I mean, it's one thing. It's harder if you're the one paper in a town that relies on advertising dollars from local corporations to take activist stances on certain things. I mean, the phone will ring pretty quickly, I think, in certain situations. And so I think the pressure from advertisers on single paper towns has probably had a lot to do with the way in which unions have been covered in recent years.
Advertisers and the city fathers. One of the things that I always used to urge, I did the Victims in the Media program at Michigan State. I would urge all of my victim groups to go down and schedule a meeting with the editorial board at the local newspaper, because they are constantly hammered by the Chamber of Commerce and the realtors and all of the business developers in town who regularly schedule opportunities to come down and tell them why they're not covering the things that they want them covering. Does the union try to get into those editorial board meetings too?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because just today in the Lansing State Journal, I submitted an editorial about Occupy Lansing, Occupy New York. It's in the Lansing State Journal today. But yeah, we're trying to step it up and do just that, We also have in the UAW member to member or worker to worker, where we try to do a lot of things in person. But absolutely, we're trying to take advantage of that. When we went to New York, I have an iPhone. I know some of the people I went to New York with also had Blackberries, and we were sending pictures and doing interviews and trying to get our story out as best we could.
One of the things I'd like to ask Ray, or at least have you comment on, I think maybe you remember, I'm not sure I said this on the air, but I probably did. I noticed in New York they were starting to occupy the sidewalks in front of CEOs' homes in New York. And that's been talked about before here in Michigan, is to go visit Snyder where he lives.
Nice walled community there. I always think that would be nice. Some of us who've spent some time training police, I mean, what we really have is two-track policing. We have policing for the rich, which are private police forces behind those walled enclaves, and then the public policing for the rest of us. And they're not maybe as polite and nice sometimes as those people behind the walls. It'd be fun to see a group occupy where Mr. Governor Snyder lives. That might be a little bit of fun.
Well, again, when we were in New York, it's such a highly populated, dense area. There were so many shoppers and tourists and stuff. It was sort of hard to tell the difference between the protesters and just the people going up and down the streets of New York, except there was a line of police that sort of separated them. But I can't really comment on going to anybody's home or anything like that. But I, the more that we get involved, the better. Really it's about democracy, and that's the other big, huge point. If 1% controls 50% of the wealth in this country, I mean, that's not democratic. And, it's time for people to speak out and step up and get involved.
One of the things we saw this morning was a woman arrested outside of Bank of America in New York when they moved they're taking various targets now and going after them. And what they had was a group of very well-dressed protesters who went in to cancel their accounts. And Bank of America decided to call the police when this group tried to cancel their accounts. And they locked the doors and locked them in. But this one woman escaped, right? So she's outside with her suit and she's clutching her things saying, all I want to do is cancel my account. And the police come in and haul her away. I mean, it's almost, you couldn't do it better if you were trying to get a movement going. It's the idea that the police are now the instrument of Bank of America, which may not be one of the more popular institutions. Do you think if they arrest a few Wall Street bankers, everybody's going to be happy?
Well, I think, there's a funny sign that was in New York. It said protesters, 5,000 or 500 arrested. And then it said, CEOs arrested zero. So, that was pretty funny. But, I don't know. I mean, I think hopefully people can get involved again. I mean, that's the reason why the 9 of us from Mid-Michigan went to New York, was to get people curious, think about it, become involved. And since we've come back, I think the movement has grown, not because we went to New York necessarily, but just because through social media, and again, as at the conference today, I heard of this 99%. I heard people talking about occupiers, and so I'm hoping that, something can start. I mean, where it's going to go, I have no idea.
And you saw the collapse of the New Left shortly after the end of the Vietnam War. Many people felt that wasn't the only issue, that the draft certainly was not the only, ending the war was not the only issue, but the movement really dissipated very quickly thereafter. Is there a sort of central theme here that the government could, end this movement if they made one bold stroke, or?
Well, I don't think the New Left ended. I think a certain presence ended, but
I never knew where to go.
It had a lot of effect in higher education, and
okay, all right.
It
has its residual effect. Yeah.
Yeah, it has a lot of residual effect, and so I think it's pretty difficult to predict what the consequences of these movements are, even if it's just a few hundred people and it seems like a flash in the pan. It may very well not be. It's hard to really know, what the consequences will be and how those ripple effects will spread out and what other movements they'll inspire. And so,
is there another event planned for the Capitol here that you know of, Ray?
Not that I'm aware of. But one of the things that's interesting, I think, about this movement, maybe in comparison to some in the past, it's not just a single issue. Like, for example, it's not just about the environment. And so I think it's broader, and maybe that will give it a little bit more power, hopefully, a little more, maybe it'll stay around a little bit. But not that I'm aware of in terms of anything coming up. Just that I know there's people out there right now. There's a whole tent city there, so I was happy to see that.
I'm gonna get down there with that video camera. I've got so much video backed up now. I'll be editing until I'm post-retirement age here very quickly. Michael, if you take a look at the media landscape nowadays with the consolidated media and the corporate media, what about the kill switch on the internet? If things got really volatile, do you think that the government would move in? Do they have the kind of power to just shut this off?
No.
They wouldn't.
I don't think they could. I mean, you can certainly target individual you can't shut the internet off. It was designed not to be able to be shut off. That was the whole point of designing something that could withstand a nuclear attack. I mean, they could certainly go after.
But they didn't care, though.
Well, I don't think you could do it in the United States. I think you could go after individual users who were doing things that the government deemed out of line, but I don't think you could shut off this movement's access to the internet. I just don't think that would be something that I don't think it's technically possible.
I think the government is very keen to have a kill switch, and I think that it's been built as a backdoor in the major Cisco systems.
There's too much commerce that travel. I mean, I don't know how
you may be onto something there.
It's like a metastasized tumor in some ways. I mean, I don't know how you unplug certain people from it and then leave the grid intact to have all the commerce flowing over on a regular basis. I mean, that's the sort of bargain.
They'll put up with a lot if you can still shop.
Except Jeff Bezos won't.
Yeah, right. He may have more power than the government does.
But they certainly can and will probably go after people who say certain things that they deem to be out of line in one way or another. But I don't think they can.
One of the people that's in my video is Norman Pollock, who is he goes back in the protest movement. He's been protesting now, he figured, for 63 years. I mean, he shook hands with W.E.B. Du Bois. That's how far back he goes into this movement. And he said that, he's looking at this as a really burgeoning movement that he thinks can really turn into something based on what he's seen in the past. And he feels that back in the 60s, what you saw were a lot of movements coming together. The feminist movement, the civil rights movement, all of these different movements sort of cohering. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this one, because it seems this has a stronger presence of young and old. The 60s, I remember, it was a lot of people under 30, but I'm not so sure anymore that, there were a lot of people my age out there protesting. So this could be a really interesting cultural shift, couldn't it? Are we looking at Gray Panthers coming back? Ah.
Yes.
Maggie Kuhn, wherever the soul of Maggie Kuhn will be revived. Maybe that's my goal in life.
You know, in Wisconsin, like New York, there was a lot of older people. I did notice that quite. I mean, I remember a lady in a wheelchair that was 90 plus, and in New York there was older people in New York City too. So I think you're onto something there.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. We're going to be talking about this repeatedly. We're going to be having next week's guest will include John Beck, talking about labor issues, and I'm hoping we'll get some of the young men from the North Star Center to tell us what's going on. They've been doing some of the local organizing, but I would love to thank our guests, Dr. Ann Larrabee, Ray Holman of the UAW, Dr. Michael Stam. It's been a lively opportunity to discuss all of the things going on with Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Lansing, a continuing theme in our programming. You can follow us on www.lansingonlinenews.com. 1:30. I know which button to click. There we go. That was fun.